A book in 10 minutes. What if I summarize Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope for you in 10 minutes? Why does this book matter? This is a history of the 20th century from Dr. Carroll Quigley, who was Bill Clinton's mentor. He says on the back, he heard the call of Professor Quigley. How dare you? Now, Tragedy and Hope is important because it's a history of the 20th century from the elite perspective. It's the perspective of an archivist for the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Quigley, who was a military historian at Georgetown University. And so not only did he mentor and train Bill Clinton, he also was, as I said, this archivist, this historian for the Atlanticist power bloc. And in this gigantic tome, what he does is he gives us the establishment perspective of the 20th century. And it's kind of an apologetic. It's kind of a defense of the 20th century and its world wars. So the two world wars represent the tragedy. The hope represents the democratic, capitalist, free market order that the West wants to set up. And Dr. Quigley was a proponent of this order. He's not a conspiracy theorist by any stretch of the imagination. He is, again, a defender, a historian of the establishment. And this book is so important because it gives us a reorientation for the 20th century. It reorients our paradigm and allows us to understand this whole century from the vantage point of the power structure, not from mainline academics and normie historians. This is really a book written for CIA section chiefs in the 1970s. It's written for the international relations policy elite. It's not really written for the common man. And I read this many years ago, and I did a lecture through the whole book in about 16 hours, I think. And you can get that if you go to my website, you subscribe to the archives, you get access to the full text. He begins the book by talking about the role of the monetary power in the last several centuries, going back to the invention of gold notes and the creation of fiat currency, and how that really was the battle plan for the Bank of England and by extension in the Federal Reserve, using that same system. That same power structure, which is allied not just with the British establishment, but with the Anglo-American, the American establishment as well, hence the Anglo-American establishment title that he gives to the text. That establishment was interested in, again, extending this power bloc to the rest of the world, but it had two chief rivals, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia. And so the 20th century, according to Dr. Quigley, was mainly a way to mop up that opposition, to exhaust it, to deplete it, and to get it to succumb to a new order of the ages. And for the most part, the first two world wars were part of that, successful in that endeavor. After World War I, you had the establishment of the League of Nations, which was set up by this entity, by these people, the Fabian Socialists essentially, to create a proto-world government. That didn't really succeed. There was a lot of opposition in the U.S. at that time. And so eventually after World War II, which the Royal Society and people like H.G. Wells wrote about years ahead of time, by the way, in the shape of things to come, they erected the United Nations, which was the post-World War II structure for proto-world government then. Also, other economic structures were set up, like the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks. Other entities were set up that would sort of interconnect these locking groups, steering committees, NGOs, foundations, think tanks, all working for this establishment and for this structure. By the middle of the book, Quigley has one of the most fascinating and overlooked chapters, which is the erection of the technocratic control grid. And people think about this book that know about it, and they usually go to the end of the book where he discusses the monetary elite funding socialism. And that's a very important chapter. I don't want to overlook that. But equally important is the middle chapter that discusses, again, in the 1960s, the future plan to erect a technocratic world government. This would be a technocratic model where smart cities, where computers would run everything, were planned out way ahead of time, right? MIT, what would eventually become ARPANET. He was writing this book right around the time that they were really beginning to think up the cryptography behind the internet and the creating of ARPANET. And so that middle chapter is so crucial because he literally says that you will live in a kind of a smart city in the future. You'll live in a coon pod. He doesn't say those words. But that's essentially what he's getting at, and that's what you have to understand. As the book progresses, the other really important chapter is the chapter where he discusses the interlocking think tanks, foundations, groups, policy-making groups, steering committees that other books like David Rockefeller's memoirs discuss in detail as well. And these entities, he says, were really responsible for pushing a soft socialism, pushing Fabian socialism, pushing more and more left ideas and left progressive agendas, not because of any humanitarian ideas really, but for the purpose of social engineering to steer society in a long-term way towards a technocracy. So that's the real goal behind the counterculture even. And so he even kind of anticipates, writing in the mid-60s, the counterculture left push of the later 1960s as actually part of this overall structure. And this overall structure wanting to steer society in the direction of a top-down technocracy. The book ends with a discussion of the Middle Ages and what the pros were of the Middle Ages, and maybe we can find some semblance of ethics coming out of the Middle Ages and carry those over perhaps in this technocratic, democratic, capitalist future order. But that's, again, really far-flung in my view. He basically takes the worst aspects of Western civilization and says we need to propagate those into the future because that will be the future technocratic order. So the tragedy is the two world wars and the exhausting and depleting of the two enemies of the Anglo-American establishment, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia. The hope is the future democratic global order. So it's a monumental text. It's an absolutely necessary book when it comes to international relations on a true, realistic level, not the system level, but what's really going on in international politics, what's really going on in geopolitics, what's really behind a lot of the wars and a lot of the events is the big players, right? CFR, trilateral, that kind of stuff, making the calls about big world events. Now, if you like this, as I said, you can go to my website. You can subscribe to my work. You can also go to my Rockfin. And I cover this book in, I think, 16 hours of talks. Today was just the 10-minute breakdown. Hopefully you enjoyed that. You can support my channel by going to chalk.com, that's CHOQ.com, and getting a hold of something like the the Shilajit for mental focus and clarity. Tomcat Elite, great for boosting testosterone. 7 Wonders, great product for overall nutrient deficiency, boosting the minerals and whatnot that are missing from our modern diets. Highly recommend going over to chalk.com, using that promo code J50 for 50% off. You can use the promo code J53Life to get 53% off all recurring subscriptions. And this is the first in my book in 10 minutes series. After this, we'll get into other texts. I'll try to work through all of the Global Elite text and do a book in 10 minutes talk for you guys. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, comment below. Tell me other books you would like me to cover and summarize in 10 minutes. A lot of people find the long-form content enjoyable, but maybe they don't have time to do it. So I also want to give everybody short-form content in a tight 10. So let me know what you'd like to cover next.